Good morning, everybody. Welcome to Safe Defend Live. I am Dave Evans with the great Doc Greg Vecchi, and I'm sporting my SEC clothes for my daughter today as Ole Miss takes on Georgia. But we're going to talk about school safety today and what is the difference, and do you know the difference between making or posing a threat? Doc, this is your thing. I think I know what it is, but I know you're the expert. I look forward to learning more from you today about how to keep our kids safe at school.
Well, you've heard it enough. You could probably teach it yourself. That's for sure. And before I get going, I wanted to wish you and Phil a happy Veterans Day, and to all the veterans that are watching. I appreciate your service. Thank you very much.
Yeah, I appreciate that. I'm going to pass this on to all the families out there that have loved ones that are deployed downrange or serve in this country. God bless you and thank you for keeping me and my family and all of our friends safe. You do not know how much we appreciate you and what you do, and we understand the sacrifice. So thank you so much.
So I want to talk a little bit about, how teachers, schools, even organizations, other organizations, can get a better handle on threat assessment, right? So threat assessment really kind of useless, right? Unless it works, right? And one of the things that is common, because there's just some misunderstanding of the process, is, how do you know when someone is really posing a threat or just making it and not meaning it? And that lack of knowledge or lack of understanding costs tons of money, tons of time. And the other problem that you'll run into is possible liability when you are saying that someone is going to be violent and they're not, right? Or if you say that they just the opposite, right? So these false negatives and these false positives, right? You say, oh, he's not going to be violent, and he is. You say he's going to be violent, and he's not, right? And that's problematic because it clouds everything and actually just kind of makes the assessment process pretty ineffective. That's one of the things that I've focused on my entire career is, how do we know when there's a real threat? What can you look at? What are things to think about when you hear something that sounds bad, right? It sounds like a threat, or it is a threat, right? Especially with kids. Okay. And I want to focus a lot on kids because kids are unique because they, first of all, they're young, they're inexperienced, they have no life experience, and they just don't have the maturity to deal with life's frustration and things like this, and that factors in a lot to some of the threats that we see in schools. The bottom line is when we're talking about threat assessment, what it is a problem solving approach. We are basically identifying a problem and trying to solve it, and the problem we're trying to identify is whatever the problem is that child's having, right? Because at some point, something happens. I always bring up bullying because that's the most common thing. If that gets out of control, that can lead to violence if there's no intervention. And you can't do an intervention unless you've assessed the threat accurately. And so we look at the threat assessment as a problem solving approach, right? And so when you hear statements that appear to be threatening, whether they're real or not, it is an indicator of frustration. And so that indicator of frustration is what we're starting to look at when we try to determine, hey, is this a real threat, or is he just talking, right? And so one of the things to keep in mind is that these type of threats can be they can be direct, they can be indirect, they can be implied, and they can be veiled, right? They can even be conditional. So some of the things to listen for before you make your assessment on your threat is it direct, right? So an example of a direct threat is a student saying, I'm going to kill you. That's an example of a direct threat. Okay. Example of an indirect threat might be, I'm going to kill him. Another example we call an implied threat. That might be, you better watch out. Another one, which we call a veiled threat, is you may not want to come to school on Monday. Just kind of put it out there, right? And then we have another one, a conditional threat, and that's if you do that again, I'll kill you. Now, the person who's doing that has control over the violence typically, because let's say he makes one student makes a disparaging comment about the girlfriend of another student. He gets angry and says, "You do that again, I'm going to kill you." That would be like a conditional threat. So those are the different threats, but just knowing those different types of threat doesn't determine whether they're real. Is it just making or posing? And so that's the kind of the next step we have to get into. When we're looking at this, we have to look at the threat in context, right? We have to see, okay, what is the circumstances around it? Because we want to know the context, we want to know the meaning behind the threat, and if there's really any intention of carrying it out. Now, with kids, fortunately, most of the threats are just making threats. They are what we consider transient threats, threats that are just done in a moment of frustration, but there's really no reason to that they don't have a reason really intent to carry it out. We see this in, like, for example, someone fouls someone else in a football game, right? And one team member gets angry at the other team member and says, I'm going to kill you for doing that, right? You made us lose, the game or whatever, right? Or they're doing it as a joke, right? I'm gonna come in here and kill everybody, right? And or it might be hyperbole, it might be out of anger, it might be frustration, right? So this is what I mean by context. Context is really, really important, because it's really fairly easy to make that determination as to, okay, are we dealing with someone who is just angry, frustrated, or do they really mean it, right? And so when you're looking at that, what we have to understand is that these transient threats, probably about 80% of the threats you'll hear from a student in a K through 12 school is going to be transient. They're not going to be real threats. But like any other threat, you've got to take every single one as if it were real. But when you're looking at the threat to determine, hey, look, is this hyperbole? Is this transient? Is this not real? Is he just making a threat because he's frustrated? Or is he posing a threat because he's really, really serious about committing violence? And one of the things that we do to determine if the threat is meant to last, right? If it's going to have a lasting intent, right? Is simply, again, just like another threat assessment. If you see a student, or you hear a student, or someone tells you or observes a student making another threat, we don't make an assumption right there whether it's real or not. We make the determination that we need to find out more information. And really the key here that almost always works is that nearly every transient threat, every threat that is really not meant as violence, it was a joke, it was frustration, every single one of those end in an apology or an explanation that makes it clear why the threat never really existed. And that is one of the, I guess, hacks for threat assessment, that if you can make an effort in your threat assessment process, teachers, counselors, other student family members, when you hear a threat, you got to deal with it. But the next step is not to jump to, oh, we need to intervene, or he is or he isn't going to be violent. We have to make that determination by determining, okay, is this a lasting intent to hurt someone? And so you have to look at the context. And again, I'm looking for that apology or explanation. If I get an apology or explanation, okay, which is about 80% of the threat cases typically that happen in schools, then essentially what you've done is you've intervened. You've told the student that you heard what he said and that you took it seriously, and you put him on notice. And so we can just pretty much at that point maybe just watch and wait, maybe monitor a little bit and things like this. That would be an appropriate intervention, right? But if you go to that kid and you say, hey, you said you were going to kill little Billy. What do you mean by that? He goes, well, I'm going to kill him. I'm going to go buy a gun, and I'm going to go learn how to use a gun. I'm going to come back and I'm going to kill him. Okay. No apology. And the explanation doesn't explain it away. Now we have someone who poses a threat that we have to then do more investigation and more protection as far as a potential victim, and then decide what we're going to do with that student. So that is kind of the nuts and bolts I wanted to cover today. Kind of short and sweet. This is Veterans Day, but an approach to give everyone in schools, everyone in the workplace. an idea how to determine, is that threat real or is it not? And this is a great way to do that.
Yeah, I think what I hear you saying, and I think it's really important for me to understand this, every threat is a real threat and it needs to be addressed. And you need to acknowledge the threat. And in that process of acknowledging the threat through the conversation and the interview, understand if they're just angry or if they're to a point where they've passed the grievance level where they're going to commit an actual harmful act on somebody. Is that fair?
That's absolutely correct. I couldn't say it better myself. In fact, I probably should have just had you say that in the first place, and we could have been done already.
Oh, no. Look, I'm a simple man, Doc. I don't have as much education as you do. I just try to get by every day. So I want to simplify for the people that are like me out there in the world. There's a couple of us. So, well, that was a great conversation, Doc. As always, great knowledge. And teachers, principals, administrators, business owners, if somebody makes a threat in your office, please take the time to address it in an appropriate fashion. And that does not necessarily mean you have to call the police. Have a conversation, see where they are, and then take the appropriate next steps. Well, Doc, happy Veterans Day to everybody. With that, Dave and Doc, we are out of here.
Have a good weekend.